Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us. Today we'll be talking about US racial and eugenics policies and their influence past and present. So today's session we'll talk a little bit about the connections between American race laws, American eugenics in particular, and their sort of transatlantic influence, the extent to which they did and didn't influence the Third Reich when it comes to Third Reich eugenicist policies and racial hygiene theories. And then we'll also shift a little bit to thinking about the extent to which US racial and eugenics histories endure to the present. There's a lot of conversation about this, and so it's worth discussing, especially in this present pandemic moment, because people are still sort of talking about the extent to which we have these sort of eugenicist residues. Some people think they're stronger than residues, and we'll sort of cover that as well a little bit today. So just in terms of going through the sort of morning session for today. So let's see. So thinking about, next slide, please, eugenics as a transatlantic phenomenon, right? If you were sort of with us when we discussed this a little bit yesterday, eugenics was, of course, extremely popular in the US, but it was also very popular everywhere, right? We spent yesterday talking about the extent to which it was an international and a sort of global phenomenon. It was transnational. Today, we're going to sort of drill down a little bit more and think about eugenics in a particularly American context, and then also think about transatlantic eugenics, which is sometimes how it's referred to, right? The sort of flows and connections of people and ideas and resources, knowledge exchange that happened sort of over the Atlantic between Western Europe and the US in particular. The England and the British Isles this was a big part of it, but also Germany and the US in particular, right? And so this is a picture, for those of you who can't see the caption there at the bottom, of Henry Ford receiving the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from Nazi officials. Now, I'm picking on Henry Ford. We don't have to pick on Henry Ford. There's lots of examples, and we want to be careful not to make a sort of a boogeyman, so to speak. But Henry Ford is an important example because he was one of the most sort of well-known capitalists and industrialists of his era internationally. And Henry Ford was also a rabid anti-Semite, for those of you who don't know, and this is well-documented history, so there's really nothing that we don't know about this. And his innovations, if we can call them that, with regard to his business, were widely admired in the Third Reich. So, for example, it's well known that the Volkswagen, right, like the first German car, was explicitly based on the Model T, and that wasn't sort of an accident. That was exactly what the Third Reich tried to do, and Hitler was interested. We know that Hitler and many of the senior officials of the Third Reich were avid readers of what's called the Dearborn Observer. The Dearborn Observer was a newspaper and a periodical that was published by Henry Ford in particular, and it was sort of viciously and rabidly anti-Semitic. They published a pamphlet which is referred to, and you can look all this up, called The International Jew, right? And this was sort of read and republished in Germany in sort of a lot of different ways, in various outlets. It was made a major part of Third Reich propaganda. And so partly as a result of all of this, Henry Ford was awarded the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from Nazi officials in 1938. He did not travel to Germany to do it. And we want to be careful, and that's really going to be one of the messages of today, right? History is complicated. And while there are very strong and powerful connections that are important to talk about between sort of American racial hygiene theories and US eugenics, we have to be careful by sort of drawing sort of very crude, sort of crayon-like lines between the Third Reich, right, and what was happening in the US. It's even complicated in the case of Henry Ford. Henry Ford actually openly rejected Nazism, for example, right? He wasn't interested in being a Nazi. That's part of the reason he didn't travel to Germany to receive this award in 1938. He wanted to send a message that while he was sort of happy to exchange ideas and to be sort of colleagues with Nazi officials and with the Nazi party, he wasn't interested in being a Nazi, and never actually evidenced any desire or support for Nazism as a social movement, as a political movement, right? And so the same thing is kind of true of transatlantic eugenics and of American racial hygiene and American race laws. They undoubtedly influenced what was happening under the Third Reich, right? But there are also profound differences, and it would be sort of an overstatement to say that the Third Reich just sort of imported wholesale what Americans were already doing. That's true to some extent and not true to some extent, right? And so it gets complicated when you sort of think about it. Next slide, please, right? So This is covered most recently in James Whitman's book called Hitler's American Model, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law. And what Whitman is really looking at, and he's certainly not the first person to do it, nor does he claim to be the first person to do this kind of study. This is just sort of one of the really more sustained sort of book length looks at what was happening. And what he's really interested in is the extent to which the architects of the Nuremberg race laws under the Third Reich really were paying attention or were sort of interested in how American race law was sort of operating at the time. Most people sort of intuitively understand when we think about what we understand as the legacy of Jim Crow laws, right? And the ways in which American states, Jim Crow laws were generally state laws, right? The extent to which American states were sort of regulating and governing particularly their Black populations in the first quarter of the 20th century. Most people intuitively understand that Jim Crow laws are an important part of this, but I think one of the services that Whitman sort of does for us is help us understand actually it goes way beyond Jim Crow laws. And there's a pretty powerful argument, in fact, that Jim Crow laws weren't even the most significant and important laws that the architects of the Nuremberg laws were actually looking to. And this is what he talks about in his book. He actually shows that, for example, citizenship laws, and I'll talk about that in one moment, and anti-miscegenation, which is intermarriage, racial intermarriage is miscegenation, right? Anti-miscegenation laws were even more powerful. And the reason this is important to separate from Jim Crow laws is because most of the citizenship laws were actually passed at the federal level in the 1920s, right? So Jim Crow law is a state law phenomenon generally. It's the states that were regulating Black people's movement, freedom, their liberties and entitlements under their own state laws, right? Federal law is really governing immigration and citizenship. And most people, if you want to see that one of the most xenophobic and racist laws the US has ever passed, Jim Crow is certainly perfectly fine to look at the state level. But at the national level, you would be looking at the Immigration and Quota Acts of the 1920s. There's almost universally acclaimed to be some of the most racist because they just imposed very strict quotas on immigrants, particularly Irish immigrants and Jewish immigrants in particular, and Asian immigrants. Asian immigrants had already been barred, by the way, from citizenship all the way back in 1880. So that's 40 years before this, right? In the 1920s, the US Congress got around to barring other groups who they didn't like, for example, right? In the belief that it would sort of dilute the purity of a sort of mythical white nation, right? And this was overt in the 1920s. Not coincidentally, this is also some of the zenith of power of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. Not coincidentally, the state we're sitting in right now, Colorado, also features a lot of the zenith of power of Klan officials. This was actually a Klan state in the 1920s, and we can actually talk more about that in the conversation if you want, right? So it's really these citizenship laws in particular, regulating who and who wasn't going to be able to count as part of the body politic. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. The state, right, as being this sort of a model for the family in general, and who got to count as part of the sort of public body of the state. And this is really what the architects of the Nuremberg race laws were most influenced in by particular. Yes, they paid attention to Jim Crow. Yes, they were very interested in how the US had treated its indigenous peoples. Not well, obviously, right? But they were particularly interested on the federal level, right, on these citizenship laws and anti-miscegenation laws. And that's not surprising for a country that was, for a party that was really seeking to exert totalitarian control. They weren't obviously too keen on letting sort of individual regional governments, right, sort of dictate what was going to happen with sort of racial purity and racial hygiene, right? So next slide, please. And this will be sort of the last sort of conversation for today. For thinking about what this means for us today, I think there's a number of different elements, right? One question we'll be talking a little bit about in the remainder of our conversation this morning is the extent to which these eugenicist beliefs, ideas, and theories infiltrate our health practices and the way we think about the health professions and provide healthcare and do public and population health. But I think it's really, really important to understand something that is fundamental to almost all work in public health law as a field, which is that law is actually a major, major social determinant of health, right? So the laws we pass and perhaps the laws we don't pass have a huge influence on population health and health outcomes. and go a very long way to driving the inequalities we see along race lines, along gender lines, and along disability status as well, right? And so this is not actually too difficult to understand once we start to think about it, but most people tend not to think so much about law as a major social determinant of health, right? And so this slide just helps us think through some of these things, which we'll be talking about in a little bit more detail for the rest of our session today. So on the left is a chart from a public health law scholar named Ruqaiya Yarbi. And we're not going to go into this in too much detail, but what I really like you to just look at is the left side of this graphic, right? Because if you see, it moves from left to right. And on the left, Professor Yarbi has identified as a root cause of downstream health outcomes, that's all the way on the right, health and well-being, structural discrimination of various kinds, racism, sexism, ableism, and classism. And then if you look immediately to the right of that, one of the major tools through which these root causes become translated into these different kinds of health outcomes is law, right? Political processes, statutes, cases, budgetary decisions, regulations, enforcement. I would also add citizenship, right? Immigration laws, right? Who counts and who doesn't, and who gets things from the state, who enjoys obligations and responsibilities from other communities, including governments, but not limited to them. And that has a really, really powerful effect on health outcomes, right? So thinking about structural violence, in particular, these historical patterns of domination, oppression, and subordination, and then thinking about how those conditions actually become embodied, right? How does structural discrimination of the kind that we will be talking about in US history, under the Third Reich in particular, and then sort of connecting past to present today, how do these conditions become actually embodied? And there's a surfeit of evidence that laws and policies are very, very powerful mechanisms for sort of mediating these sort of historical patterns. And I think that's what we want to think about a little bit when we think about connecting past to present. So I'll stop there. Thanks so much.